Thank you for viewing this recording of a free event provided by Next Village San Francisco for our community. Next Village San Francisco is a local nonprofit providing services and support that empower seniors to live independently in their own homes. We welcome people who want to keep connected with their community as members, volunteers, and supporters. We host 30 to 40 free activities and events each month for the public, and our members have access to our network of volunteers. Learn more and get involved at nextvillagesf.org. We hope you enjoy this video.
When Next Village asked me to present again, I realized it was the month of October, and October is Halloween. So I thought, what a great idea it would be for me to present my San Francisco Landmarks Uncensored, saucy, scandalous, haunted, ghostly. San Francisco has an astounding number of officially designated landmarks, actually 400. And when we look at them, we think, boy, those are grand and they're elegant. But when I was researching for this book, San Francisco Landmarks, I realized that many of these landmarks and their locations, and some places that I call, and you'll see them, they should have been landmarked. There's a lot of stories behind these places that we don't know about. Here's a landmark, the Golden Gate Bridge. Here we are at the Golden Gate Bridge in Fort Point, my favorite location in San Francisco. It is a triple landmark. It's a city, state, and national register landmark. And before I begin, I want to say there is a disclaimer. When I mention these hauntings and scandals, I'm not implying that they're 100% true, although they are definitely mentioned in numerous newspapers and documents. But that doesn't mean they are irrefutable fact. Perhaps I should call them urban legends. So here we have the Golden Gate Bridge, a triple landmark with the famous fog. So what happened here? You're going to have to wait till the end for this one. We're going to start with some mysterious spaces. And what are those and where are they? Well, they could be the Westerfeld House on the left or the Flood Building, or they could be way out to the Pacific Ocean and the Sutro Estate. At the top left, we're looking at the Sutro Mansion when it was looking its best around 1886. And below we see the mansion derelict as it looked in the 1930s. Now, the Sutro family donated the estate, the mansion, the statues to the city, and the city decided to tear it all down in 1939. What they did leave behind were some of the statues. If you go to Sutro Park, you might see some of the statues, but the story that's interesting is that many, if not most, of the statues had disappeared. But they're still there. So the statues are buried. Now, that is actually one of the strangest buried treasure stories, because we're not talking about gold and jewels. We're talking about a dozen Grecian statues. Here's some of them. Here's Sutro by a lovely Venus. So after his death and the destruction of the mansion, 1940s, these statues began to disappear. There are various stories, various accounts, but the one I like best is one from the Sutro Park gardener who said the statues were buried in an unmarked location in the park because authorities were afraid that the statues would make inviting targets for bad actors. That to me is a mystery. It is unexplained. No, everybody has an opinion. So if you really want the full story, you should visit the National Park Service website, or on a dark and stormy night, maybe on Halloween at midnight, you might want to go out to the park, which is not lit, with a shovel and try to find them yourself. Now, nearby is this place, was this place at Land's End. You're seeing the Haunted Swing on the left, and the Mystic Maze on the right. They were here, this is 1896, and this street, this dirt path was called the Merry Way, which is odd because everyone thought these structures were haunted. The Mystic Maze was housed, as you can see, in an ornate building, and it had a labyrinth of mirrors. The Haunted Swing, there it is. The Haunted Swing, pictured here, could hold about 40 people, and it would rock back and forth, and then spin 360 degrees around, scaring the people. And they decided it wasn't physics that did this, it was haunted, which I like better because it fits with today's theme. And nearby were the Sutro baths. Now, these covered 3 acres, accommodating up to 10,000 people. But the interesting thing is, by all accounts, many people felt very uneasy. Well, look at this place. They felt very uneasy. They felt it was haunted from the beginning. Some locals have speculated that the land below the baths might be cursed, and psychic mediums reported feeling an unnerving force. Some paranormal investigators have called the baths a smorgasbord of horrors. And you've probably already heard about the Sutro bath ruins, the abandoned tunnels, the abandoned caves. Well, the word on the street is that they were used for human sacrifices. The baths are rumored to be a meeting place for the Church of Satan. According to local legend, if you carry, who would, but if you did carry a candle through this tunnel to the end, some force would grab it out of your hand and throw it in the water. Here's another definite must for midnight on Halloween. And nearby was what should have been landmarked, but is only a point of historical interest. We call this Sutro's Castle. It's the second incarnation of the Cliff House. Sutro purchased the original Cliff House. He drastically changed it into a Victorian castle, which is no more, sadly. But San Francisco does have its own castle, and that would be Julius Castle. Now, Julius Castle was a restaurant. It was a dwelling at the top. It was designed by architect Luis Mastrapasqua for the Italian immigrant Julius Raz. Sadly, it's closed, but as you can see here on the right, it was the location for the film House on Telegraph Hill. Absolutely stunning movie, which does make, the poster does make the house look very scandalous. What Fox Films studio did was they built the false front of a house in front of the castle. We can see that at the lower right. And they used it for the house that was in the film. Julius Castle is San Francisco Landmark 121. Now here we have the Flood Building. It is an official San Francisco landmark, 154. It was built on top of the ruins of the Baldwin Hotel. The Baldwin Hotel did burn to the ground. And the Flood Building is actually a place where Dashiell Hammett worked for the Pinkerton Detective Agency in the 1920s. One day I decided to gain access to the building. There was a guard, and I made it past the guard in the lobby, and I pretended I had an appointment with my own private detective on the 3rd floor. The guard just nodded me to the elevator, so I went up to room 341, which is at the top left. I was really disappointed when I found that the door was locked, but I did hear voices. And it really did sound like Sam Spade talking to his secretary, Effie Perrine. Next, I went to the staircase. This is the staircase where it is said that Dashiell Hammett, what a stunning staircase, that Dashiell Hammett would smoke cigarette after cigarette. So my intention was to look for the cigarette butts. Now I smelled cigarette smoke, but I found no cigarette butts. This is worth a visit if you can pass the security guard. And just a few blocks away at 63 Ellis is John's Grill, where Hammett would frequently dine. John's Grill is a literary landmark. You can see the plaque at the lower left. The third floor room is said to be where Dashiell Hammett at least wrote part of the Maltese Falcon, and where his ghost appears regularly at 11 a.m., quoting from a newspaper, as if he's waiting to be served lunch. For years, the restaurant displayed the Maltese Falcon statue, which was one of the originals from the movie, but it was stolen in 2007. It was replaced. I went to a movie supply house in San Francisco about 30 years ago, and I bought my own Maltese Falcon statue that looks very much like the one on the right, and I was assured it was not the stolen original. During those years that Hammett was wandering around in the fog, the inhabitants of this landmark, the Whittier Mansion, 2090 Jackson, the inhabitants were Mr. and Mrs. William Weir. Now, Miss Mattie Weir was the daughter of William Whittier, who built the mansion in 1894 at a staggering cost of $152,000, staggering at that time. He was the founder of Whittier, Fuller and Company paint manufacturers that now we know as Fuller O'Brien Paints. I really did visit this place many times when it housed the California Historical Society. And I have to tell you, that place is oppressively spooky, spectacularly oppressive. According to Dolores Riccio in her book, Haunted Houses, quote, many people have reported seeing a ghost in the building. I speculate that the alleged ghost is Billy Whittier, the ne'er-do-well son, alcoholic, they say, of William. Billy inherited the mansion and he lived there until his death, upon which time Mattie inherited. But there is more. According to the San Francisco Chronicle, January 1950, Mattie sold the house to the Nazi government in 1941 for $44,000, and the mansion was turned over to the German consulate. The Chronicle article states, and I quote, "A black limousine, once the property of Adolf Hitler, there we go. Once the property of Adolf Hitler drew up to the curb. We can see the house here, interior and exterior. And who came out of the limousine but Franz Wiedemann, who took over the house. He purchased the home, and he is known to be one of the top advisors to Adolf Hitler. And here we see Fritz on the right. Well, eventually, during the war, our government seized the mansion and put it up for sale. In 1956, it became the headquarters, as I mentioned, of the California Historical Society. And then over the years, it was sold numerous times, and now it is, again, a private residence. But it does have, as the article said, one of the strangest histories of any building in San Francisco. Another very spectacular Victorian, the Westerfeld House, San Francisco Landmark 135. It's across from Alamo Square. It's famous for its Victorian architecture, but also for its colorful residence. It was built in 1889 by Candy Baron William Westerfeld for around $10,000. And in its over 130 years, this lovely Victorian has been home to hippies, prostitutes, musicians, icons, a murderer, and urban legend, another Nazi house. It was in 1928 that a group of Tsarist Russians purchased the house and turned the ballroom into a nightclub called Dark Eyes. 1930s, it was turned into a place called the Russian Club, where urban legend has it and was an illegal brothel. I actually did find that in the phone directory of that year. And moving on, renters over the years included jazz saxophonist John Handy, Janis Joplin, Jerry Garcia, and the Grateful Dead. And this was the site of the first hippie commune in San Francisco. Interior. A few years later, Manson family member Bobby Beausoleil lived here before he joined the Manson family and was convicted for the murder of Gary Hinman. And that wasn't all. More drama followed when Satanist Anton LaVey brought his pet lion in here, supposedly climbing these stairs. The pet lion attacked the wood paneling and left behind claw marks, which I've seen during a house tour. The pet lion's name was Togar, if anyone's taking notes. And by the way, it's such a famous home that there has been a documentary which you can find on the internet called House of Legends. And that's not the end of Anton LaVey. This is about the curse of the Fox Plaza. The grotesque structure at the left replaced the stunningly beautiful Fox Theater on the right. And I was there in July 1963 when I witnessed the wrecking ball demolish one of the most glorious movie theaters in San Francisco. And so, of course, the Fox Plaza should be cursed. Plenty of San Franciscans cursed the idiocy of those responsible, and one went further. Anton LaVey, he was the Fox organist at the time, and he is said to have cursed the property. May not believe it, but here are the facts. In 1965, a 5-ton crane collapsed and one man's legs were crushed, 4 others were injured. Then the suicides began. A man jumped from the 26th floor apartment in 1967. Another man jumped 22 stories in 1971. A 45-year-old cabbie shot himself in the face and crawled out of his balcony. In 1975, a bus jumped the curb at Taylor and Market, killing 3 people at a crowded Muni stop. In 1979, a sniper rained bullets on the plaza. I'm thinking maybe it's time to change the name from Fox Plaza to something I really don't want to say. So maybe now is the time to move on to haunted locations, and where might they be? One of them is definitely the Queen Anne Hotel and the family-friendly Golden Gate Park. Now, the Queen Anne Hotel, we see it as it looks now in the lower right, is an absolute stunner. It's at 1590 Sutter Street, and it should have been landmarked. It's a pink jewel, originally built for Senator James Fair, who was a wealthy Nevada Comstock mogul. And he built it, believe it or not, as a boarding school, a finishing school for wealthy young ladies, and he named it the Mary Lake School for Girls in 1890. He built this at a cost of $45,000, and as headmistress, he put one of his favorite ladies, Mary Lake. Now, we see part of a San Francisco Chronicle article here, very extensive article that interviewed both Fair and Lake, and they both denied the rumor that they were having an affair. Apparently, it was a huge deal in the city at that time. This was called a scandal back then. Unbelievable. Anyway, they both denied that Miss Lake was his mistress. Eventually, the school closed in 1896, 2 years after Fair passed away. But there are reports that Miss Lake was really upset. And some 130 years later, it is currently a bed and breakfast where it is said the entity of Mary Lake wanders around keeping an eye on the guests. And everybody, well, Even their website reports there have been manifestations in Miss Lake's office, which is room 410. So that's the room you want to stay in. Here's another stunner. Now this beauty, the Manrow House, is no longer there, but when it was there, it should have been landmarked. If it was still there, it would have been at 2700 Larkin. It was quite the sight. Manrow was a successful civil engineer who fashioned his house in 1851. We see here, I believe that's him in front. He designed it as a Swiss chalet. It just looks so pretty, but it was eventually called the House of Demons and was considered at the time the most haunted place in San Francisco. The whole thing started in 1856 when Manrow's sister came to visit, and all the odd things started to happen. According to the newspaper article, which we'll see in a moment, quote, items flew around the rooms. Manrow said he narrowly dodged an axe that was thrown at him by no one. The Chronicle article continues to say acts of spite and mischief and elfish pranks were played in broad daylight on a daily basis. They even had a formal seance here in 1856, try to figure out what was going on. And here's that absolutely stunningly illustrated San Francisco Chronicle article that has a very, very lengthy story about the house. I'm not making this up. And the article, which is absolutely brilliantly illustrated, says in part, the doorbell began violently ringing. Sofa cushions were hurled about the room. People felt their hair pulled and their arms grabbed. A figure in human form, I think they tried to draw it here. A figure in human form rose from the ground. Its countenance was so terrible, so repulsive, and so frightening and cruel that the whole party fled in horror. Sadly, the house was torn down in 1927, and now there's an apartment building. Now this landmark is still there, and it looks very much like it does here. This photo was taken in 1895, the Atherton house. 1990, California. The story on the street is that this is haunted by the spirits of Dominga Digoni Atherton, her son George, and George's wife Gertrude. And that would be Gertrude Atherton, the author. Faxon Atherton was a wealthy, successful businessman, very wealthy. The town of Atherton, where he had his first California homestead, was named in his honor, the town of Atherton. When Atherton passed away, Dominga and her son and his wife moved here. She had this house built. And here's the cast of characters from the left to right. That would be Gertrude Franklin Horn Atherton, Dominga Digoni Atherton, and George. And there's the newspaper article that tells my story. These two women were very powerful, and George was not. They hounded him and dominated so much that he fled to Chile. Well, he sailed to Chile, where he became quite ill and passed away. So they had to return his body, and they did so. It was placed into a barrel of rum to preserve it and shipped back to the mansion, where it was opened by the butler, who was shocked to find his deceased employer pickled in a barrel of rum. George was dried out, and he did receive a proper burial, but that wasn't enough. He decided to come back and haunt the two ladies. This became such a story that Sylvia Brown held, she is a ghost hunter, Sylvia Brown, held a seance at the Atherton house, and she claims the haunted vibrations were coming from the female ghost, not from George, because she said He's pale, frail, and there's nothing to fear from him. Now, it's been over 100 years, but according to urban legend, the ghosts are still there. People that stay there have reported knocking, cold spots, and gusts of wind. And some people have concluded that there's at least 3 ghosts in the house. So when you walk by the Atherton house, you peek in the window, if you dare, and see if you can find the 3 ghosts. Here's another pretty one, the Chambers Mansion, San Francisco Landmark 119. It's pretty on the outside, but it's pretty weird on the inside. 2220 Sacramento Street, built in 1887 for Robert Chambers. He made his fortune in the silver mines of Utah. He moved to San Francisco, moved into the mansion with his wife in 1887. His wife passed away, and in moved 2 nieces who absolutely hated each other. And I'm quoting from a San Francisco Gate article of 2018. It was an unhappy arrangement. The nieces did not get along. One of the nieces was named Claudia, and she meets the most unfortunate end, and under very murky circumstances. Most sources say she died in a farm implementation accident and was sawed in half. So pretty. The Curran Theater, another should have been landmarked. Here we see it in 1922 at the top, one of the lobbies in the lower right. Next time you go buy a ticket here, think about the poor ticket booth attendant that was murdered in 1922 during a robbery. Apparently, his ghost is often seen in this lobby. And I'm quoting from the Curran's own website. Whether you believe in ghosts or roll your eyes at such a notion, generations of Curran audiences and staff have reported hearing eerie sounds throughout the theater, and some even claim to have seen an apparition in the mirrors. The San Francisco Art Institute, landmark number 85. This remarkable building was built on top of one of San Francisco's biggest cemeteries in 1927. And from the moment it opened, everybody seems to report that it's haunted. And I'm quoting from the Night Watchman in 1947. I listened to the footsteps climbing the first level, and then to the second level, and finally to the third, where my room was. My door opened, but there was no one there. There's never anyone there. And many accounts say this happens over and over again, especially after a woman jumped from the tower that you see here about 50 years ago. And there's been numerous reports of hauntings to the point where apparently regular seances are held up in that tower. We're going to jump over to the Presidio, Fort Mason Historic District. Hauntings have been reported. This is one of the contributing buildings to the Fort Mason Historic District. The building was built on top of the foundations of the original Army quarters back in 1855. And it's among the oldest existing buildings in San Francisco. But that's not all. As the story goes, there have been numerous reports of sightings that take the form of a man in a dark suit wearing a top hat who paces back and forth. Most people think this is the ghost of U.S. Senator David Broderick, who stayed at this house before he took part in a duel with State Supreme Court Justice David Terry. David Broderick was shot. He died and was brought back here after his death. So people are saying that the gentleman still wanders around. We're heading over now to the Russian Hill area. This is the Hanford Mansion at 1001 Vallejo. It is still there, and it is a contributing structure to the historic district. Now, this house looked haunted, has always looked haunted, but the real story behind it is the people who lived here. And this could be a book in itself. This is the Hanford-Verdier Mansion. It was built in 1905 for Robert Hanford, a Western Pacific executive. From 1919 to 1953, it was home to the Verdier family, Paul Verdier, whose family founded the City of Paris department store, another lost landmark. Now, the photo at the bottom right has absolutely stunning find. It's very weathered photograph, and on the back it says that in very elegant writing, it says the House of Mystery. So I was intrigued by that, and I wanted to find out why. Well, here she is after she's been remodeled, but at one time flamboyant artist balls were held in the ballroom where apparently very wealthy, famous men would chase pretty young ladies around the ballroom in some type of event. And it's interesting that over the years, the renters have been noteworthy. One of them was Madam Sally Stanford, who leased the house, and I mean madam as in brothel madam. Sally Stanford, she leased the house in the 1930s. But as you can see here, top left, it's been extensively remodeled inside and out. And it just recently, well, within the last few years, sold for a staggering $12 million. Now, what's interesting is that if you're living here at a $12 million mansion, what you're doing is actually living adjacent to a cemetery. So this might be the time to ask, where are the bodies buried? I mean, we've been talking about hauntings, so let's find out where the bodies are buried. And the answer is all over San Francisco. At one time, the city contained 54 cemeteries, including Russian Hill, Lincoln Park Golf Course, Telegraph Hill, I love this one, City Hall, and Mission Dolores. We can see the plaque at the lower left commemorating Russian Hill, where the graves of a number of Russian sailors were found up at the top of the hill. The Yerba Buena Cemetery was bounded. There's an article about the Yerba Buena Cemetery at the top left. It was bounded by Market, McAllister, and Larkin, which means it is currently under City Hall. I won't say anything more about that. So that's depicted in that article. And a gardener working at the Lincoln Park Golf Course says, and I quote, "Whenever we find a bone, we put it right back. We don't want any bad luck." And seriously, skulls and femurs are common discoveries at the Lincoln Park Golf Course. In 1900, cemeteries were banned in San Francisco, and most of them were moved. But another place there was a cemetery was at the base of Telegraph Hill. We see Telegraph Hill in photo top left, 1865, and they were quarrying the hill. And I'm going to quote from a newspaper article of July 24th, 1847. "A public burial ground has been found. It existed between 1825 and 1857, location between Sansom and Battery, Broadway and Vallejo. Number interred, 80 to 100. And that's the area at the top left. And according to the San Francisco Bulletin of 1857, quote, "The old graveyard on Telegraph Hill. During a late storm, an avalanche of rock and dirt occurred at a quarry on Telegraph Hill. Buried high up on the hill were several coffins, and upon examination, it was found that a great number of graves were scattered about. Luckily, I'm not sure, but that's what it says. Luckily, the coffins were in a remarkable state of preservation. I don't know about you, but maybe I've had it enough with these graveyards. So I'm moving over to Golden Gate Park in Stow Lake, which is in the Golden Gate Park Historic District. Such a pretty scene. It's a beautiful place to walk your dog or take a walk yourself. But when the sun goes down and the fog comes in, Stow Lake becomes a walking ground for the lady in white. This ghost story goes back 100 years, very well documented in many locations, and it goes like this. Once upon a time, there was a woman who was walking her baby in a stroller. While she was sitting, the stroller rolled away unnoticed, and the stroller with the baby fell in the lake. Thinking the baby had fallen into the lake, she went in after it and hasn't been seen since. Well, that's not quite accurate, because there have been numerous reports of a woman dressed in white emerging from the lake saying repeatedly, hysterically, "Have you seen my baby?" Sad. So we're going to move on to something more fun, which is scandalous people and places. And who are those scandalous people and where are those places? Well, people aren't landmarked, but their antics occurred in landmarked places. So we're going to explore Jack's Restaurant, the Barbary Coast, Sally Stanford, and Lola Montez, among other places. First, we're going to go here. Does anyone know what this is? It's a mess, is what it is. Well, what it is room 1220 at the St. Francis Hotel on Labor Day, 1921. It is a shambles because silent film star Fatty Arbuckle, seen at the lower right, hosted a wild, wild party at the hotel, which ended in the death of a young actress. Fatty was incarcerated, as you see here. He was ruined. He was under a $3 million contract with Paramount Studios at the time. His career was completely ruined. He was found not guilty. Now, he's not the only scandal. The St. Francis Hotel is said to have the most famous ghosts in the city, including Edith Pope, who is believed to be seen floating through the halls in a flowing white dress. I don't know what's up with the white dresses. John Barrymore is another one who still, quote, enjoys his favorite room. And it's interesting to note that this stunning architectural gem of a hotel is not landmarked, but Union Square in front is. Now we're going to move into another hotel, the Palace. And in my opinion, one of the most scandalous things about the Palace Hotel is that it is not landmarked, but the Garden Court restaurant in the Palace Hotel is landmarked, number 18. Very odd. It's been the location of several unfortunate incidents, one of which was this one. We almost lost Lily Hitchcock Coit to a shooter. According to these two San Francisco Chronicle articles from 1903, quote, Major McClung was shot defending woman in her room at Palace. That woman was Lily Hitchcock Coit. We see her depicted here. The other headline reads, Mrs. Coit's deposition, a very graphic story of the tragedy. So what happened was that Mrs. Coit was meeting in her room. She was having a bit of an altercation with Alexander Garnett. The altercation became so heated that Garnett pulled a gun on Lily Hitchcock Coit and fired. She wasn't injured because someone jumped in front of her to protect her, and that was Major McClung. He jumped in front of her to protect her, and he was shot. He later died. Garnett was sentenced to prison at San Quentin. So it's just hard to believe that we might have lost the stunningly wonderful Lily Hitchcock Coit. On that note, we're going to go dine at Jack's Restaurant, which is a landmark. The building is there. It is a landmark. It's there, but the restaurant is gone. It was at 615 Sacramento. And it was one of the oldest restaurants in San Francisco that originally opened on this site in 1864. It was named Jack's, supposedly, because there was an empty lot across the street, which was the home to literally hundreds of jackrabbits. Now, our story is about a story in the San Francisco Chronicle. Quote, Jack's is where the second floor private dining rooms were at once a very popular bordello. The rooms were eventually converted into private dining rooms, where businessmen would dine with their secretaries at lunch and then come back in the evening to dine with their wives downstairs. We see the downstairs dining room here. Speaking of dining and booze, let's wander over to the Barbary Coast. Barbary Coast was predominantly centered around the area we know as Pacific Street, but at one time Pacific Street was called Terrific Street for a reason. San Francisco's Barbary Coast district was notorious for scandalous behavior, home to many bars and brothels, including the Hotel Nymphia, supposedly the worst and largest, most notorious brothel on the West Coast. And I'm quoting from the San Francisco Call, 1899. This is a long one, but it's worth it. A group of angry citizens held a meeting in Washington Square Hall saying the Nymphia is a public nuisance and a health hazard because it is the haunt of the petty thief, the house burglar, the tramp, lurid women, cutthroats, and murderers, licentiousness, debauchery, pollution, loathsome disease, insanity, profanity, and blasphemy. The building was eventually condemned in 1902. Well, the whole area was revamped and transformed into an upscale, high-end, antique showroom and interior designer area, and is now the prestigious Jackson Square Historic District. Now that is culture shock. Now, one of the ladies that would perform in the notorious Barbary Coast was the notorious Lola Montez, who arrived in San Francisco in 1853 from Panama. Now, it's hard to believe this beauty was considered scandalous. It just boggles the mind. She did have a violent temper, exotic exploits, and extraordinary beauty. She made headlines throughout the world. But what everybody wanted to see at the Barbary Coast was her spider dance. Wearing flesh-colored tights and layers of multicolored petticoats, Lola played a country maid who discovered that spiders had gotten into her clothing, and she would dance wildly and provocatively. And this was considered scandalous. She became one of the most popular performers of her time in the Barbary Coast. And what was adjacent to the Barbary Coast was the area we now know as Maiden Lane. It was equally notorious. Interestingly, it is the site of a landmark now, number 72, the V.C. Morris store, designed by architect Frank Lloyd Wright in 1848. And it's you can see it at the top, center top left. It's the only Frank Lloyd Wright building in San Francisco. And the alley is the most renamed street in the city. According to research, the original alley was called Morton Alley and was home to some of the most notorious brothels in the city. The name changed from Morton Street or alley to Union Square Avenue in 1898, 2 years after the brothels had been cleared out, and at a request of businessmen to rid the alley of its previous aura, the name was changed again to Manila Alley, and eventually in 1922 to Maiden Lane. And since we're speaking of maidens or madams, here's a good one, Tessie Wall. She was, at her time, the most infamous madam of San Francisco. She was born Teresa Susan Donahue, 1869, and was a madam who owned and operated brothels in San Francisco for a long time, 1898 to 1917. One of the most successful madams we had. At one point, she was married to a gambler and political boss who she attempted to murder in 1917 simply because he wanted to divorce her. Even so, in the 1920s, she was the unofficial, or maybe official, queen of the annual policeman's ball held at the Civic Auditorium, if you can believe it. Oh my. Her brothel was in the fashionable Tenderloin district, and it was called a beacon of elegance and good taste. She herself was described as a flamboyant, well-upholstered blonde with blue eyes and a hard drinker with a big heart, and allegedly was able to outdrink boxer John L. Sullivan. She had a brothel at 211 O'Farrell, 33-7 O'Farrell, and then lived in this stunning mansion, the Perrine Mansion, which is a point of historical interest. Another madam, I'm moving on several decades, and I want to quote from Sally Stanford. Beware of people whose halos are on too tight. I've always remembered that quote. As we know, mayors are not immune to saucy stories and scandals, and neither are madams, and Miss Stanford was both. She was well known for many escapades, and especially for being the operator of 1144 Pine, we see in the center, a handsome establishment, quote, furnished with many rare antiques, including a Roman bath 9 feet in diameter. This stunning house was designed by renowned architect Stanford White. She purchased it, maybe because of his name, who knows. She purchased it in 1940. Sadly, the house was demolished in 1961 to make way for the most god-awful condominiums. But one of her establishments still survives. That was the Hanford Mansion at 1001 Vallejo that we visited early. And I just want to note that Sally was not born a Stanford. She was born Mabel Janice Busby. She named herself, according to her autobiography, Lady of the House, she named herself Stanford because she saw a wonderful article about Stanford University in the newspaper and decided that was a classy name. Now, what's interesting is that wealthy and influential men from all over the world made up her clientele, and they included princes, movie stars, national dignitaries, California state and local government officials. So famous that Herb Caen wrote, quote, "The United Nations was founded at Sally Stanford's whorehouse." Herb Caen was referring to the delegates who attended the founding conference of the United Nations in San Francisco in 1945, many of whom were her clients. Herb Caen went on to say that a large part of the actual negotiations for the United Nations actually took place in her establishment. In 1951, She married Robert Gump. We see Robert and Sally at the left. Robert Gump was the grandson of Gump's department store founder, Solomon Gump. They were divorced 9 months later. Now, this is extremely controversial, but it is documented in newspapers. So I'm going to quote from newspapers. A few blocks away from where Sally lived was the secret tunnel of Nob Hill, well documented in these two articles from 1940, 1965, San Francisco Examiner. One of the article reads, in part, in 1940, in an empty lot where the Crocker Garage is located today at 1040 California, while taking soundings in Nob Hill's earth for the foundations of a new hotel, engineers discovered below street level a hidden passageway which had lain clogged and forgotten for nearly half a century. The entrance to the tunnel, it can be seen in the article. The tunnel was reported to be 150 feet long, about 9 feet wide, and 9 feet high. And it went from one side of California Street to the other and ended in the Flood Mansion. Quote, ceiling tightly bricked in a vaulted arch. It was assumed at the time that the tunnel connected the old Flood Mansion to 1015 California Street across the street. This is the area around that time. We can see the Flood Mansion at the top right, California Street. So according to all accounts, the tunnel is there. Why it's there is the mystery. But the Examiner said in 1940 that the descendants and relatives of the two families involved deny any wrongdoing. There was no affair between the lady on one side and the gentleman on the other. They do say, though, that possibly a lady opens a door into a dimly lit brick passageway that tunnels under the streets, emerges at the other end. She climbs another set of stairs, enters a private chamber, and is quickly wrapped in the arms of her lover. The article concludes with, for years now, people have been spinning yarns, usually on some dark and lonely night when the fog rolls in and the horns are blowing like a ghostly voice out of the past, about the network of mysterious tunnels that underlie San Francisco. And here's the Flood Mansion, San Francisco landmark number 64. I have a story. The lovely wife of one of the descendants that founded the Pacific Union Club is a friend of mine, and she invited me to dine with her and her husband at the Pacific Union Club. I did an article about her new book, and she really liked it, so she wanted to treat me with lunch at the PUC, as it is affectionately called. When I was escorted through this club, it is absolutely breathtaking and massive. And I couldn't help but wonder what happened at that table. What happened in that dark corner? The wood paneling is unbelievable and it's spooky. Just a few blocks away was the Ding Dong Daddy of the D line. Now, this gentleman does not look scandalous at all, but he was the Car Barn Casanova. And I'm reading again from a newspaper. I didn't make it up. For 3 months in 1945, a short, rotund, bald man replaced Frank Sinatra as America's latest sex symbol. The man was Francis Van Wee, a 58-year-old streetcar conductor who is called the Ding Dong Daddy of the D line. Francis had an affinity for mature females And between 1941 and 1945, he married 5 women that he never divorced. His career, matrimonial career, began when he was 18, has been married 13 times. So he's on the run now from police. He flees to LA, where he's found and tried and convicted and incarcerated to San Quentin for 10 years. Now, the interesting part more interesting, is that famous criminal defense attorney Jake Ehrlich, financier Louis Lurie, and hotelier Ben Swig actually established a defense fund for this guy. He was released early, and upon his release, he married his 16th wife. The ding-dong daddy of the D-line. From him, we're going to go to another mode of transportation, and that would be the ferry boat. Now, the El Capitan ferry boat we see here at the top is not a registered landmark, and there's a reason, but the ferry boats can be landmarked. We have the landmark Eureka. Now, the reason the El Capitan cannot be landmarked is that it sunk in San Francisco Bay on a dark and foggy night in 1868. So place yourself on the top deck. The date is November 3rd, 1870. This is where California state legislator Alexander Crittenden sat with his wife when he was shot by his mistress, Laura Fair, on a lovely sunny day on the bay. Coincidentally, absolutely bizarre, the witness to the event was none other than Leland Stanford. Laura, pictured here at trial, was the first woman in California to be sentenced to die by hanging, but was acquitted in a second trial. Now we're on the water, and I'm heading back to another watery place where we began. Like I said, we're coming back, the landmark Golden Gate Bridge. We're probably all going to agree that the most iconic and intriguing films filmed in San Francisco were those of Alfred Hitchcock. And he stood here, as you can see in this photograph, at the Golden Gate Bridge during the filming of Vertigo, where he is said to have said, quote, "San Francisco would be a good location for a murder mystery." And of course, he was right. So I'm ending where I began, with the beautiful Golden Gate Bridge triple landmark, my favorite outdoor spot at Fort Point and Golden Gate Bridge, the wonderful fog. And equally wonderful is this scene from Alfred Hitchcock's Vertigo. Some of you may remember Jimmy Stewart pulling Kim Novak out of the water here. I know some of us remember her clingy, wet dress. But that's really not the scandal at all. The interesting part is the scene we see here where he rescues her in the water and walks up 2 or 3 steps. Well, that wasn't filmed here. The scandal is, the mystery, or the interesting part, is that it was filmed in a backlot in Hollywood. So to me, I see this as a real trick or treat. And that's the end of my presentation.
Thank you for viewing this Next Village video recording. We hope you enjoyed it. Please help us spread the word and tell friends and neighbors about Next Village events and services for seniors and adults with disabilities in San Francisco. Visit our website to learn more about our vibrant, growing network, as well as to view our calendar of upcoming Zoom and in-person events and activities in San Francisco. Our website is nextvillagesf.org. Contact us to join our email list to learn about events and resources for seniors in San Francisco. And subscribe to the Next Village YouTube channel by clicking the button below.